Hello again, Juan Lama here, and welcome to another video. This time I want to talk about something very important in the programming world, the backend. I had an idea several days ago where I thought I could make a brief approach to different backend languages by creating the exact same API resource. Something very simple in the end. So I decided it could be a good idea to record this video where I try to explain some fundamentals about three important backend technologies. Of course, I don't want to go into much details about this. My only purpose is to show some differences and similarities. It's just a glimpse, as the title of this video claims. Of course, this could be a more explanatory resource, but all I want to do is to show some basic concepts. Today, it's almost a required skill to know something about backend, at least to have an idea of how the backend communicates with the frontend. I think in a lot of companies and referring to the workflow, sometimes it will be a plus if you are able to take care of some duties regarding to the backend. And this is based on the requirement asked for many jobs that I have encountered recently. Even though I don't consider myself a professional developer just yet, I can understand why so many companies require to have a foundation in backend and understand how a database works. Ultimately, the success of a programming project depends on the dynamic and persistent data, and for that you are going to need a backend developer. I want to make a little introduction of the databases that I typically use. I have here the MySQL database, which is one of my favorite relational databases. I like PostgreSQL too with pgadmin, but in this case I want to focus on MySQL only. You can check the official MySQL website to get the latest version or just to get more info about it. I have to say that this was the first database that I learned, so that's why I love it so much. I remember those days when I was basically working with MySQL Workbench, which is a desktop UI to handle SQL queries, create schemas, define stored procedures, create triggers, and so on. And I know this software is really amazing. These relational databases are very consistent, and the fact of having a defined schema with primary and foreign keys make this approach very useful in certain cases. In the other hand, I have here MongoDB, which is a different database consisting of collections and documents instead of tables and rows. Of course, there are more options like Cassandra or Elasticsearch, but right now I only know MongoDB. It's based on JSON format, I mean the structure of the data, without relationship between tables. For example, you cannot do things like left or right joins to work with multiple tables. I normally use this option with Node.js, and I really like how you can create these documents and, for example, you can save a arrays of objects as a field. And in my opinion, that's very cool, because, for example, you don't need to establish many-to-many relationships with an intermediate table like in MySQL. The database of this API is something very simple. It consists in a table that stores news. So I have the title of every news, which is required, the author, that is a nullable field, the content, as well as a primary key, which is an auto-increment and unique field, and so on. Notice here that I'm using PHP and the main goal of this video is not to make a big database with relationships. I just want to show the bare minimum of a database and expose that database to some APIs. The MongoDB version is very similar. I have the Compass software that helped me to show the collections, and actually there is only one collection that holds the data. As I said earlier, I don't want to explain too much about this, otherwise this video is gonna be endless. I want to start with Java Spring Boot and the web page where you can actually create a skeleton of a Spring project with the required dependencies. It's based on a Maven project, by the way. Of course, you can create this directly with the Eclipse IDE, but I find this approach more comfortable. In this case, I have specified a group and an artifact name for this demo, but most importantly, I have selected some dependencies such as DevTools, JPA for persisting the data, and this includes Hibernate, of course, my SQL connector to establish the corresponding connection with my SQL, and I also have included ThymeLive because I'm going to use some static HTML, and this templating engine is really useful. I'll come to that later, but these are the essential packages that I need for this little demonstration. So I only need to hit the generate project button and download the zip file. After that, all I have to do is import the unzip folder as an existing Maven project and let Eclipse to download the jar files through the POM XML. So I use Open Eclipse, and this is the newest API project. I have already finished the API, and I have made that just for saving time. I don't want to build this from scratch here on this video, so as I mentioned before, I'm going to analyze some key parts of this little example, and at the same time I want to share my opinion after making the exact same project on 3 different platforms, so I can give a proper answer. As you can see, it's a Spring Boot project with a standard structure, and I want to start showing the application properties file, which has the connection parameters for SQL in this case, for creating a connection to my local database. I have specified an user with high privileges on my PHP and a password. Don't worry about the password, I use this just for testing purposes on my local machines, so I don't care about that. And I have included the dialect of the database. You have to keep in mind that every database has its own dialect. So in this case, I put MySQL5 INO, which stands for InnoDB, and it's basically the store engine for MySQL. The last line is needed to indicate how you want to manipulate the database at a startup. But I'm more interested in analyze the code itself, so I want to skip this and go straight to the point. In the data access layer, you can follow different patterns, so I know 2 of them. The DAO pattern, which stands for Data Access Object, and the repository pattern. These are commonly used to persist data. The DAO pattern is a class or an interface that contains methods for a particular Java entity. So you can define some method signatures in case you are using an interface and then apply that interface to a class. I'm going to stick to the repository pattern though, but the DAO pattern is perfectly fine. This repository pattern consists on an interface that inherits from another interface. In this case, I have inherited from JPA repository. Of course, you can use other alternatives like cracked repository or just define the methods without inheritance, but I'm going to use this one. This interface gives me a bunch of useful methods to perform some actions in the database, like find all the rows from a table, find a specific row by ID, create a new entry on the table, delete a row by an ID, and so on. All I have to do is include an entity and the type value of the primary key. So the entity is basically a representation of a table in the database with Java code. So now it's time to show the entity of this API. I have implemented a structure of Java packages to divide this project logically. So all these packages are under the main package, which is the package where Spring Boot initialized the app. A Java entity is basically a representation that can be mapped to a table in the database. For that, you only need to create a simple Java class, in this case a POJO, and indicate a couple of things that are mandatory for JPA to recognize this class as a valid entity. First, you will need to annotate this class with the entity annotation. And second, you must specify an ID with the ID annotation, so JPA can determine what field represents the primary key. The other annotations are optional, but I like to use them in order to apply some validation rules or to indicate the name of the columns. This class has different attributes, and they are encapsulated as private, of course. So you can see these attributes represents the column of the actual news table. Each of them annotated with the column annotation, and some of them with validation rules, like not null or size. Of course, you can go deeper with validation, but I don't want to spend too much time about that. Finally, I have generated the getters and setters to be able to access these private attributes from an external class. Another question here is the service. You can omit this step because it's not strictly necessary, but I want to include it because it helps to follow the convention. The remarkable things here are, of course, the service annotation, used for indicating this is a service, the outerwire annotation that is used to inject dependencies into classes. In this case, I want to inject the repository created previously, then I can define the methods from this class. I have declared a variable that stores the repository so you can call the methods from here. And finally, some methods. In this case, for getting all the news from the table, another for getting a specific item by ID, and of course one more for creating new items, and for deleting specific ones. So you can see how I call methods inherited from the API repository just by using the variable declared above, using the methods that I need depending on what I want to perform. And finally, the controller. This Java class gathers important concepts like the RAS control annotation used for treating this class as a REST API, the cross-origin annotation for indicating the cores, and this is required to work with multiple servers. In this case, I want to communicate this server with an Angular server, so I have specified the URL of the Angular development server. And of course, the request mapping annotation for establishing a base URL for this entire API. You can also see the outerwire annotation again to inject the previous service. The methods are pretty much the same of the service class, but I have indicated a couple of things. First, the mapping of each method. In this case, I use get for getting the news with get HTTP protocol, and others like pause for saving items, delete for removing items, etc. Also, you have to put the URL of each method so you can call them from a web browser or from another JavaScript project. The other important thing is the status code. You should return a different status code depending on the action you perform. So you can use, for example, a 200 status code OK or 404 and so on. The get single news method, for example, it receives a path variable from the URL, in this case the ID, and returns an optional object of type news, because it could be null if you indicate a wrong ID. And you could catch any potential exception that might occur, but I don't care about that in this demonstration. The last thing I want to talk about is the HTML pages. Actually, it's not necessary to include this HTML content in a REST API, but I have included a sample of a web page used for getting more style on my front page. For that, I have used ThimeLeaf. This tool helps you to make your HTML content more structured. So you can create fragments of repetitive code and then use them anywhere you decide. In this case, I have created fragments for the header and the footer, so I don't have to copy and paste that code in every page. The result of this API is something very simple. So I start the development server of Spring Boot and call this project on my web browser. I have used a materialized template, and I have added a button to get all the news from the database just by calling the URL. So you could type the URL API/news and remember the request mapping where I indicate that. And I get all the news stored in the database. And you have to keep in mind that your SQL server must be running to access the data. So now it's time to talk about Laravel, which is a modern open source PHP framework, and it's based on Symfony, which is another PHP framework. I really like using Laravel because it was the first tool that I used for building a web project. I can assure you that this is one of the easiest and more powerful frameworks that you can find these days. In the PHP world, it's the most popular framework according to the Google Trends page. And that status is only possible if you have released a tool that is loved by many developers around the world. From my perspective, Laravel makes things easier, and that's a lot if you are working on a real-world project. Next, I'll try to make a tour to the structure of this tool by talking about some folders, the MVC pattern, or some features that are worth to mention. This is the structure of a Laravel project. It seems to have too much content, but many of these files are config files and boilerplate code added by Laravel. The app folder is where you can find the models. In this case, we have here the model that comes with every Laravel project, the user's model. Is useful if you want to implement a login system. And the news model. This model was created by me in order to be able to represent the news table with PHP code. You can also see the sections folder, where you can create error handlers in case you want to catch sections. The HTTP folder is very important. It contains the controllers folder, where the controllers of the project are stored when you create them from the Laravel CLI, and the middleware folder, where you can create middleware files to protect routes from certain users or check if a user is logged in. The config folder is used to specify some configuration parameters, such as make configuration in case you are using a mail system. And you can see here environment variables obtained from the env file. I'll talk about that later. The database folder is also very important. It contains all the migrations files, and those files are used to create the tables on the database through the Eloquent ORM, with all the relationships and the parameters indicated in those migration files. The seeds folder is used for filling the database with dummy data, in case you are testing your project and you want to have some rows in your database. The public folder contains the static content, and the index.php where the project starts. The resource folder has interesting things like the JavaScript folder, and this folder has a Vue component inside, in case you want to use Vue.js in your project. You can also see here the SAS folder for the styling. The routes folder is also very important. It includes some files for the routing system. So you can see here files for web routes, in case you want to implement some routes with a static web content. In the API file, you can define the routes for an API. So for this project, this is the right place to build the routes. The channel file, which is used to create routes in case you are working with real-time functionality, for example by using Pusher with a notification system, and you want to broadcast an event, and then you can listen that channel and get any data. The test folder is used to implement unit testing, very good for test-driven development. The vendor folder contains all the Laravel dependencies, and you don't need to change anything from that. The composite.json file is needed to control the Laravel dependencies and some info of the project. The package.json is the same, but is used by the JavaScript code to control all the dependencies. So for example, if you are using libraries like jQuery or Vue, you can check the version from there. Now I want to mention some things before going any further with Laravel code. First, and this is very important, in order to create Laravel projects, you have to install Composer. And Composer is a tool for dependency management in PHP. You can also craft whole projects thanks to this utility, so all the structure that I showed you before was generated by this command. If you are using Symfony, you are going to need this utility as well. Another important thing that I want to talk about is the Laravel official webpage. This page has one of the best documentations that I ever seen. Of course, this is just my opinion. You can actually see things like how to install Laravel, how to create projects with different commands, as you can see. For example, I use this one right here, how to use PHP built-in development server, and this is very useful. And you can find info about everything. So if you don't remember anything about, for example, Eloquent ORM, you can see a lot of info here, like all the relationships, how you can create them, and so on. The last thing I want to mention is the MVC pattern that Laravel follows. So according to the Wikipedia, This is an architectural pattern that divides an application into three interconnected parts. So you have the models that represents the shape of a specific object, and that object could be anything, for example a car, a person, a computer. So that object, in this case a news object, has different attributes like a title, a content, an author, and all that is mapped into a table in the database by the ORM, in this case Eloquent. The controller is where the logic of this project is placed. So you can find here the methods to perform actions with the models, like retrieving all the rows from a table, save an object, and the results are sent to the views. And the views are just the HTML content that displays all this info. In case of an API, maybe you don't need views in the server because that output is created by the frontend team. Starting from the beginning, the first file you probably need to change is the .m file. This is a hidden file, and that's why it has this .name. And that makes sense, keeping in mind that this file contains many important keys and passwords. This file has all the environment variables. So you can see here variables for pusher, in case you are using pusher, for indicating the API key and passwords provided by pusher. The mail configuration. So if you are using, for example, Mailtrap, you can place here the parameters of your account. But the most important thing here is the database parameters. So I have written my user and password of my local database. So now I can get communication between this project and my database. Notice here that I don't need to download any MySQL connector like in Java. Laravel comes with that included, so you don't need to worry about that. It's time to talk about the news model in more detail. This is just a class that inherits from model, and that's required so Laravel can treat this class as a valid model. You can create this file with the PHP artisan command, so you only have to write PHP artisan make model and the name of the model. You can see here an array that contains all the attributes or columns from the news table. The array is called fillable because Laravel needs to know which fields are good to be public fields. In this case, those fields that we want to expose so others can see them and manipulate them. In this case, I don't have things like password or tokens, so I don't have to hit any of these fields. For that, you have here this hidden array in case you have password or something related to that. In this file, you can also include any relationships you have between this model and other models. But in this case, I just have a single model for the news table. The news controller is very important. Here I have written all the methods that I'm going to need for getting all the news, get single news, and of course, like in Spring Boot, you can catch any section with this try-catch block, but I'm not worried about that. It's important to import the previous news model so you can use it here in this file. Once you have imported that news model, you can use the model class and call static methods like all for getting all the news, find or fail for getting single news, and so on. You can also specify validation rules. And notice here how I add a bunch of rules separated with a pipe. And of course you can create a new instance of the news class and add it to the table in the database by using the fields obtained from this request object and then save that instance. Again, you can also return a JSON response with a status code depending on the action you perform. In order to access the previous methods, you need to declare some routes that point to those pieces of code. Right here you can see a route of type get for getting all the news by calling the corresponding method in the controller. This consists in an array where you can specify the controller you want to invoke as well as the method you want to use. And you can also give this route some kind of alias. And this approach is useful to identify these routes independently. I have routes for access the create method with post request, for deleting news with the delete HTTP verb, and that's pretty much it. The last thing I want to talk about is the HTML content. Keep in mind that this part is not necessary in case you are building an API, but I would like to talk about the template engine just a little. For that, you're gonna use Blade, and Blade allows you to make a lot of things like for each loops to iterate arrays, if conditional to show or hide certain HTML elements, double curly braces to display variables, and things like that. You can also use HTML fragments and insert them anywhere you decide. Or you can even extend templates so you could have a hierarchy of HTML pages. And for example, you could have a main page and children pages extending that base page with their own code. The result of this project is the same of the Spring Boot version. So I'm gonna start the development server and see the front page of this API. I have used the same materialized CSS for styling the page, and I have this button again where you can call the API and get all the news. You can even use tools like Postman to call these endpoints in a better way, with headers and the content. So this was the Laravel version. I really enjoyed creating this example with this framework because it was really quick to finish this version. And last but not least, I want to talk about Node.js. Node.js is an open source JavaScript runtime environment that executes JavaScript code outside of a web browser. This section is very interesting if you are a front-end developer, usually working with Angular, React, or something like that, and you want to become a full-stack developer. This is really awesome because if you already know JavaScript, now you can use that knowledge to expand your opportunities in the programming world, and that's always a plus. This technology is relatively new. It was released in 2009 and basically was written with C++ and using the BH Google engine from Google Chrome. This technology basically consists in a bunch of modules that can handle various core functionalities such as the operating system, input-outputs, networking, file systems, and so on, all with JavaScript code. Node.js operates on a single thread, using not blocking input-output calls, and it's asynchronous, and it can process multiple tasks in one thread instead of querying them. And this is different from Java or PHP where you have this multi-threading concept. Node.js is an excellent choice for your app's performance. You can even make your development process faster in comparison to other solutions. So Node.js is a very promising technology that is increasing in popularity during these years. The steps you're gonna have to make in order to start a Node.js project are: of course, you must have installed Node.js in your machine. In case you don't have it, you only have to go to the official Node.js webpage and download it. This comes with npm, which stands for Node Package Manager, and helps you to download and manage the dependencies of your project. Another required step is to have the MongoDB running so you can interact with it. In case you are using a Mac OS system like me, you can use Homebrew. So by executing brew install MongoDB, you'll get the latest version. After that, you should create a directory that holds the MongoDB config files. And you have to make sure that the directory has the right permissions. Finally, you only need to run the mongodemon with mongod on the terminal so your database will be running and you will be ready to work with it. It's time for the structure of the Node API. Actually, you have total freedom to do this wherever you decide. So all you have to do is create the folders of the project structure manually. The only thing you really need is a JavaScript main file that contains all the code needed to start this project. So you could write all this code in a single file, but that's not the approach that a developer should follow, because after all, Node.js has a philosophy of a modular code, so you can divide your pieces of code in different files and export those modules to be accessed from other files. The pattern that I have followed here is the MVC pattern using Laravel PHP. So you can find here the models, the controllers, the routes of this API, and the database configuration file. By the way, these are just JavaScript files with JavaScript code. You can also see here the package.json for managing all the dependencies, and all these dependencies are living in the Node module folder. In order to install dependencies, you should execute npm install and the name of the dependency. The dependencies used for this API are the following: Express.js, which is a lightweight framework for Node.js, and this framework comes with a bunch of packages so the development process can be easier. NodeMoon, which is a development dependency that helps us to reload the server whenever a change happens. So if you are writing a code and save the changes, the server restarts automatically, and that's very helpful. To achieve this, you only have to create a little command in the package.json. So for example, whenever you write on your terminal npm run and this word, and keep in mind this could be any word you prefer, this piece of code will be executed. So you can see this nodemoon index.js, which is the main file, and all I have here is nodemoon monitoring this entire structure. So if something changes, nodemoon automatically restarts the server with the change applied. I also have here mongoose, and this dependency helps me to work with MongoDB, so I can create schemas, models that can be stored as documents, and so on. This is the news model. First, you can see how I require the mongoose model in order to be able to create a new schema of type news in this case. I use a constant because this value should be the same during the execution of this program. Then I get only this schema from the mongoose package thanks to the destructuring of ex6, because I only need that. After that, you can create a constant and define the schema of the news model. So you can see the title of type string and require, the content, and so on. Finally, and this is very important, you have to make this code available outside of this class. For that, Node comes with these module exports, and you can specify the code that you want to expose. In this case, I use the mongoose package to create a new model, and this is required to treat this as a model. So I place here the name of this model it's going to have, as well as the schema defined previously. The controller is something very important. First, I have created a constant, and this represents a JavaScript object. And of course, you have to import the previous model so you can use it here in this file. Then I use the previous constant to define some methods, in this case for getting all the news, get single ones, create new ones, and delete them. As you can see, there are a bunch of methods and all of them use a callback function. And you can actually use this function keyword or use an arrow function to make this code cleaner. And this function has two arguments: the request argument to get parameters from a request, for example URL parameters, the content from a form, and you have here this rest argument, which is the response of these methods. You can see how I declare a constant where I use the news model required previously, and thanks to Mongoose I have access to some methods so I can interact with MongoDB. For example, I have this find to find all the news. Then I only have to return a response of type JSON with the values. Also, you can see this find by ID method to get an object by ID. And thanks to the rig params ID, I can get the ID from the URL and use it here inside this method. The create news method is very important. I only get all the info sent to this method thanks to the body parameter, and you save it as a new document. The delete news is very important too. you find the document by ID and delete it with this. And of course, you have to export this. Finally, you can see these assign await keywords, and these are used to indicate this function that these operations are going to take some time. So you have to await until these get all the news. You can also use here promises, but I really like this approach. The routes file is used to add some API endpoints to this project. You can see how I require the express module, so now I can specify some routes with this line here. I also need the controller created previously. Then the only thing I have to do is use this router constant and get access to some HTTP methods like get, in case I want to get all the news. So you define here the URL of this route as well as the controller and the method you are going to call. In this case, this route is going to use the getNews method. In case the URL is expecting a parameter, in this case the ID of a news, you can put here this column ID, so now this URL is ready to get parameters. Again, you have to put here the controller and the method you want to invoke. Finally, as always, you have to export this module. In this case, this route constant with all the routes defined, if you want to use it in another file. The database file for this project is something very simple. Keep in mind that you need this code if you want to interact with your MongoDB database and use the news model of this project. In this case, I require the mongoose module again because this module is responsible for creating the connection. So I have written the URL of my local database, in this case MongoDB, and this is the protocol, and localhost and the name of my database. Then you only have to use this connect method to establish the connection with your database. And you can check if the connection was successful with this promise. By using then, you can return any message you want to the console of your browser or catch any errors that might occur. And finally, you have to export this so I can use it later in another file. Finally, the index.js. This is the main file, and this file is called by the node command. So this is the file that has been executing all this time. You can see how I require the express here and then store this utility in a constant. I also call here the routes file. This line here is used to determine the port this project is going to use. In this case, I use here this environment variable called process_port, and in case my computer has defined an environment variable like that, then will be assigned to this project. But I don't have that environment, so I use 3000 by default. Another interesting thing is this middleware, in order to indicate this project that the data type should be treated as JSON type. Some time ago you had to use a body parser, but now you can use this approach that comes with Express. I have the routes placed here, so now this project can make use of them. And finally, this app.listen to run the development server with the port included. And you can return a console log with a message to the console and check if this is running. I hope you can understand now how is the flow of this project. So first we have here the routes, and then the routes call the controller, and the method inside of this controller. And those methods use the model, and finally the model uses MongoDB with Mongoose to interact with the database. So everything parts from here. I could store this index.js since the beginning, but maybe you wouldn't understand anything. So I thought this main file should be explained the last one, with all the previous files already covered. Now it's time to run this project. So in the terminal you can write npm run and the name of the command that I have in the package.json. You can also run node index.js, but you won't have this live reload server whenever you make a change. So I ran this command and the project started listening on port 3000. Now I can make a call to the routes defined like localhost/API/news, or include an ID and get a single news like this. I can even use a tool like Postman and make a request to create a new document like this. So I have to specify the headers, in this case application type JSON, and of course send a body with all the attributes needed. And you must change this to a valid HTTP request. In this case, we want to perform a post request. So once you do that, you can see how a new document is created. And very important, remember that you must have your MongoDB database running. I only need this command mongod, so you can see that it's running on this port. Whoa, that was a lot of ground cover. Even though this project is the simplest thing you can do with these frameworks, there are three, and I can assure you that I have put a great effort to make this entire video. So talking about these technologies and starting with Java Spring Boot, I want to mention some pros and cons just from my opinion. Talking about good things, we have here Java itself. And this language really helps you to have total control of your code, and that's very important. So you can get errors at compilation time, then it's more difficult to have certain bugs. Some people argue that Java needs more code to do the same, and they are probably right, but that effort has a reward. In this case, you have a more solid code. I also want to mention Java Spring Security. Even though I haven't used security on this project, I think this feature is one of the most complete right now. You can specify user roles and things like that out of the box. Another key feature is the fact of using the Spring initializer to create a skeleton project with the dependencies required. So this approach is the best of these three frameworks because you don't have unnecessary dependencies like in Laravel, but at the same time you can pick the packages you really want very quickly before starting the code. So you don't have to download those packages manually like in Node.js. The cons of Spring Boot could be, for example, the fact of using Maven for dependency management. And I don't know why sometimes download some corrupt jars that could break some parts of your application. I have suffered that situation sometimes, so this is why I put this here. Another thing that bothers me is the fact of not having a CLI or command line interface, because I am used to get all the dependencies with a CLI from the terminal. For me, that's more comfortable instead of using Maven and then use this XML structure to create a proper file. Maybe there are other alternatives, but I only know this one. The advantages of Laravel are the following. First, Laravel worries about the development process. So you have a lot of useful utilities already included with the framework in order to speed up the development process. So you save plenty of time and you only have to worry about coding. Another great feature is this philosophy of making things easier. You don't even need a strong knowledge in PHP in order to work with Laravel, because Laravel has achieved a tool so well structured that you don't even need to be a great developer to make great things. And I want to mention the Laravel CLI. This is one of the most powerful CLIs that I ever seen in a while. You can create controllers, migration files, models, seeders, error handlers, and so on. The disadvantages of Laravel are the following. First, Laravel includes so much dependencies, and many of them are unnecessary. For example, it includes Vue.js and at the same time includes jQuery, and this is inconsistent. I know jQuery is needed for Bootstrap, but maybe I'm not gonna use Bootstrap, so I don't need many of these packages. I am pretty sure that if you are a Vue.js developer, maybe you are not gonna use jQuery. The good points of Node are the following. First, Node is a lightweight language with a lightweight framework, and this situation makes Node.js one of the fastest technologies right now. All is designed to be fast. The asynchronous system, the fact of having use, and I'm gonna repeat this again, use the necessary packages, make this option one of the best in performance. Another great thing is the JavaScript language. So this is good for working with JavaScript frameworks like Angular, React, with just a single language, JavaScript. So you can combine all these technologies with JavaScript and integrate them with one technology. And I want to mention the fact of having total freedom to create your project wherever you prefer. And this is good, so you don't have to get used to any specific design pattern. The disadvantages of Node could be the following. First, you have to worry about all the dependencies and install them. So if you want to make use of a validator, you have to search for one. If you want to have a development server, you have to install one, and so on. I have mentioned features that are used in projects all the time, and the fact of spending time looking for these could delay your development process. So I just want to thank you for taking your time watching this. I didn't expect to make such a long video, but I wanted to show some code, and finally you, as viewer, have the last word. You have your own opinion, and I just showing my opinion. And I consider there is no better way to show an opinion than building it from scratch. So thank you again, and I hope to see you soon.